They called it the Mississippi, but for the Cherokee, it was a mirror. Every reflection on that frozen river showed the world vanishing behind them. May 26, 1838, New Echota Cherokee Nation, now called Georgia United States. The air is thick with the smell of rain and wood smoke. The ground beneath the oak trees is slick churned by hooves and wagon wheels. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a line of blue-coated soldiers waits silent, rigid rifles angled toward the earth, as if the soil itself were their enemy. Inside the town, the morning breaks without birdsong. Canvas covers flap against the wind. Pots are left half-filled on dying embers. The hush that falls is not peace, it is the weight of something about to end. An elderly woman ties a red cloth around her grandson's wrist. She whispers a word that will never appear in any official report, Givevgayu, meaning beloved. Beside her, a soldier unrolls a paper sealed with a wax crest, the order of removal. One line, one signature, one moment that divides memory from exile. The sound that follows is not a shout, nor a gunshot, but the slow creak of wheels, the first wagons turning toward the west. Dust rises and hangs like breath between worlds. No treaty line can be seen here. No border stone marks this place. Yet in this instant, the geography of a nation begins to dissolve. Fields that once held harvests will be stripped bare. Rivers that once carried songs will be crossed in silence. A boy drops the shell pendant he wears for luck. It sinks into the mud. A tiny white moon swallowed by the earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle cuts the wind. The command is simple: move. From this valley, the path will stretch more than 800 miles through mountains, across frozen rivers, past the graves of those who fall along the way. The government calls it emigration. The soldiers call it escort duty. The people call it what it is, a walking death. History would later write this down as policy, as logistics, as the Trail of Tears. But here on this damp May morning, it is not yet history. It is the sound of boots in mud, the ache of a mother's silence, the first step of thousands toward a horizon that will change the map forever. And so we begin. When the rain lifted over New Echota that morning, the world was already rewritten. Not by thunder nor by sword, but by signatures on paper. The seeds of this moment had been planted decades earlier, when the young United States looked south and west and saw not nations, but land. Land rich in timber rivers and most dangerously gold. By 1828, the discovery of gold in the Cherokee Hills of Georgia drew white settlers in by the thousands. Men with pans and rifles crossed boundaries that had never been theirs to cross. They came bearing shovels and laws. Georgia's legislature passed acts that dissolved Cherokee sovereignty, erasing courts, abolishing councils, outlawing their government in their own homeland. The Cherokee called it a quiet invasion, each settler a blade of grass that spread until the old earth disappeared beneath it. But there were deeper forces moving beneath the soil. The cotton boom had made the southeastern United States the richest agricultural frontier in the world. Every mile of Cherokee land meant more room for plantations, more enslaved labor, more profit for the white republic. Expansion became destiny, manifest destiny, a phrase still wet with the ink of ambition. President Andrew Jackson, a soldier before he was a statesman, saw native nations as obstacles to be removed for their own good. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, a single document that changed the map of a continent. Its language was careful, almost benevolent: voluntary exchange, new homelands, protection by the federal government. But everyone knew what it meant. The Cherokee Nation, one of the 5 civilized tribes, had spent decades adapting to survive, building schools, adopting a written constitution, even printing a bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. They believed civilization could be a shield. But in Washington's eyes, civilization was not enough. It was competition. In 1835, a small faction within the Cherokee, weary of fighting both Georgia and the federal government, signed the Treaty of New Echota without authorization from the Cherokee National Council. The treaty ceded all remaining lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for money and land in the west. To the U.S. Senate, it was law. To the Cherokee majority, it was betrayal. One signature gave legal cover to dispossession. One vote in Congress sealed it. Behind every clause, a shadow of contradiction. The government declared native tribes as sovereign nations, yet treated them as wards. Courts ruled in their favor, but troops enforced the opposite. In 1832, the Supreme Court's decision in Worcester versus Georgia affirmed Cherokee sovereignty, declaring that no state had the right to impose laws on native lands. President Jackson is said to have replied, "Whether truly or not John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." And so, force replaces law. Army engineers mapped roads westward. Forts rose like teeth along the borders: Fort Cass, Fort Payne, Fort Butler, Fort Gilmer. each fort a stepping stone in a march of policy. Within a few years, the Indian Territory was drawn a vast tract beyond the Mississippi, where tribes from the east would be herded together, like lines converging on a single point. The map of America began to split, not along rivers or mountains, but along ideology. On one side stood the Republic's promise of freedom, on the other, its hunger for land. Missionaries in the Cherokee Nation wrote in their journals that the people still hoped Congress would reverse the order. They continued to plant corn and hold council meetings as if faith alone could hold the borders in place. But by 1837, the handwriting was clear troops would come. The removal was framed as an act of inevitability, a transfer to ensure peace between races. In the halls of Washington, men spoke of progress. In the valleys of Georgia, families spoke of nightmares. To understand this fracture, one must trace not just treaties, but the invisible veins of power, the economic artery of the cotton trade bleeding through every acre, the political pulse of a nation trying to reconcile its ideals with its appetites, and the social nerve of fear that difference itself was a threat to destiny. Each force pressed against the Cherokee Nation until the land itself began to turn against them. Maps redrawn, borders renamed, language twisted into instruments of legality. The word removal replaced displacement. Emigration replaced exile. New Echota, once the capital of a sovereign people, became a coordinate. For the United States, the policy promised stability, expansion, and wealth. For the Cherokee, it promised a march through hunger, snow, and death. Some historians would later count it as progress, the opening of the South. Others would call it what it was, the engineered disappearance of a nation from its homeland. And yet, for the soldiers stationed in the forts, for the settlers watching from the ridges, and for the Cherokee families who still believed they could resist, the story was not yet over. The fracture in the map was widening. Lines once drawn in ink would soon be traced in footprints and tears. The question now was not whether removal would happen, but how far the wound would spread before the map stopped bleeding. Her name appears only twice in the surviving records. In one missionary's note from Fort Cass, she is listed simply as Atsadi Fish in the Cherokee language. Perhaps it came from the river where she was born, or from a father who once promised her that the water would never turn against them. The note describes her briefly: female, about 30 years of age, 2 children. Possesses small kettle-woven blanket, wooden comb. That is all history remembers a line in ink that once was a life. Before the soldiers came, she lived in a valley near the Etowah River, where corn grew tall, and the red clay held footprints after every rain. Her husband had gone north with John Ross's delegation to plead for delay in Washington. He never returned. The land around their home had already been surveyed and divided, renamed by men who would never walk it barefoot. What had been the heart of the Cherokee Nation became Lot 242, District 15, Section 2. For her, it was still only home, the place where trees remembered who planted them. She owned little that could be carried: a blackened iron pot traded years before from a white storekeeper, a clay pipe carved with circles, and a strip of wampum beads her mother had given her. The pot fed her children. The beads held their story. When the order of removal came, soldiers arrived at dawn. They were young, uneasy, and armed. Their sergeant read from a paper she could not understand. Then the locks were broken, and families were gathered. A missionary later wrote, "The women did not cry aloud. They held their children close and moved when told." Atsadi's eldest son, no more than 9, carried the wooden comb. Her younger child clung to the edge of her blanket. What she wanted was simple: to keep them alive. What she feared was everything that came after the road began. Fort Cass became the holding ground for nearly 13,000 Cherokee. The soldiers called it an emigration camp. The people called it the waiting sickness. The smell of wood smoke and sickness hung over the stockades. Women washed clothes in the creek, gathered moss for bedding, traded what little they had for cornmeal. Fever spread faster than hope. Missionaries recorded that many died before they ever set foot upon the trail. At night, the valley glowed with small fires. Between them came the hum of low voices, not songs of celebration, but of remembrance. Somewhere among them, Atsadi sang to keep her children asleep, repeating words older than the border that now confined them. When morning came, the bugle sounded. Wagons creaked and the long column began to move. They walked north toward the Tennessee line. The first miles were still familiar pine mist, red earth. Then the road turned to mud. Women filled gourds at streams clouded by hooves. Soldiers counted heads, marked the numbers in their books, then waved the march onward. Lieutenant Edward Dease noted in his journal, "The Indians are patient beyond understanding. Many walk barefoot. The mothers wrap the children's feet in cloth and go on." That was the only kindness his report allowed. By the time they reached the Hiwassee River, frost had begun to rim the branches. The ferries were crowded, the crossings bitterly cold. Some waded waist deep, holding their children above the current. The soldiers burned green wood for warmth. Atsadi burned the handle of her pot to keep a small flame alive. She met others along the way, an old counselor carrying seeds from his fields, a young interpreter torn between two languages, a soldier who quietly slipped a piece of bread to her son when no one was looking. The trail blurred every boundary. Soldier or exile, order or obedience all walked beneath the same sky. At night, she told her children that the stars were the eyes of their ancestors watching over the trail. Missionary Daniel Butrick wrote the same line in his journal, "The mothers comfort their young by saying the dead will light their path." As autumn deepened, the journey became a season. Snow came early that year. The official ledgers listed deaths by cholera exposure exhaustion. None recorded what those words meant. A mother's silence, a child's hand grown cold. Somewhere near the Mississippi, her younger child fell ill. The record notes only one small burial at dawn. They were given half an hour. Atsadi wrapped the body in her blanket and placed the wampum beads beside it, the same beads her mother had once tied around her wrist. Then she rejoined the line when the bugle called. Behind her the earth closed and the march went on. Her grief had no witness except the wind. When at last the surviving columns reached Indian territory, the land stretched flat and pale beneath the winter sun. Some collapsed in disbelief. Others began to build shelters at once, as if labor could keep despair away. Atsadi took a handful of soil and poured it into her cooking pot, the only object left from home. Into that soil she planted 3 kernels of corn. 2 sprouted, a small act of defiance invisible to the maps that claimed her. The records end there, but memory does not. In the songs remembered among Cherokee descendants, there is a verse for the women who carried fire across the mountains, who kept embers alive even as the world around them vanished. Atsadi's story, reconstructed from missionary notes and government lists, is not legend, it is evidence. She stands for those whose names the records lost, whose faces the archives never kept, yet whose footsteps remain pressed into the red clay from Georgia to Oklahoma. She wanted only to keep her family whole. She feared that her people's story would vanish without witness. And she represents a nation that believed walking away did not mean surrendering memory. History would later call the journey the Trail of Tears. But through her eyes it was something else, a crossing of worlds, a long unmaking of home, a prayer that stretched across 800 miles. Each mile a heartbeat, each step a promise that they would not be forgotten. It began with a letter, not a shout, not a gunshot, but a document sealed with wax and authority. Headquarters Army of the Cherokee Nation, New Echota, May 26, 1838. General Winfield Scott's order was clear. The emigration of the Cherokee people is to commence immediately. Treat them with kindness, but move them without delay. 2 sentences turned paper into command into movement, and movement into exile. By the end of that week, 7,000 federal troops and state militia had spread across the Cherokee homeland, encircling villages, crossing rivers, occupying churches, schools, and council grounds. The campaign was called the Cherokee Removal. In Scott's own words, it will be conducted with as little violence as possible, but history rarely obeys such instructions. From the forts, Cass Gilmer Butler Payne detachments rode out before sunrise. Each officer carried a list of names copied from census rolls. The lists looked orderly, civilized even. Each represented a family to be taken. The soldiers did not know those names nor how to pronounce them. They only knew which cabin to knock on. At Etowah Valley, the bugle sounded just as the fog lifted from the river. The men of the 4th Infantry moved quietly between the cornfields. Chickens scattered, dogs barked, and were silenced. In the first cabin, an old man was reading aloud from a hymnal in the Cherokee syllabary. When the soldiers entered, he did not resist. He only asked if he might finish the verse. The sergeant told him no. Across the valley, Atsadi heard the same command carried on the wind, the word move. She gathered her children, the blanket, the pot. Her neighbors stood outside, eyes fixed on the line of troops that snaked through the fields. No shots fired, no cries, only the steady clatter of bayonets against belts, the hollow rhythm of boots in the mud. The soldiers called it rounding up the stragglers. The people called it the breaking of dawn. Within 2 days, hundreds were driven toward temporary stockades, rough enclosures built beside every major fort. The camps were designed for weeks. They would hold people for months. At Fort Cass alone, nearly 5,000 Cherokee were crowded behind split-rail fences and canvas. Missionary Daniel Butrick wrote, "The air is filled with lamentation. Mothers weep for their lost, and the sick groan without aid." The trigger had been pulled, but the powder had been gathering for years. The fuse was the Treaty of New Echota, ratified by Congress, despite protests and petitions. The spark came when the deadline for voluntary emigration expired. May 1838 was that deadline. On the 26th, the Army moved. General Scott, a man of ceremony, issued a proclamation. "My friends, the President has sent me with a powerful army to cause you in obedience to the treaty to join your brothers in the West. Do not delay. The troops will protect you as brothers if you obey. But if you resist, they will compel you." For the Cherokee who still hoped for reprieve, the words, "my friends," burned more than the threat that followed. They knew that friendship spoken through gunpowder had only one translation. As detachments swept through the towns, Spring Place, Kuzawati, Ustanala, the same ritual repeated. Soldiers entered homes, read the order, and led families away. Doors were left open, fires still burning in the hearths. Chickens roamed empty yards. At the mission schools, teachers recorded that pupils vanished mid-lesson. They were summoned by soldiers, one wrote, and we never saw them again. The first major clash came not from resistance, but from confusion. Near Rattlesnake Springs, a group of Cherokee men fled into the woods, believing the troops had come to execute them. Shots were fired, one soldier wounded, and the men were captured within hours. General Scott forbade retaliation, but fear had already spread. Rumors traveled faster than orders that the army was burning villages, that rebels were hiding in the hills, that anyone left behind would be hunted. By June, the map of the Cherokee Nation had become a web of movement. Forts served as nodes. Roads converged into lines of dust. Rivers carried barges loaded with supplies, cornmeal, salted pork, ammunition. The government called it logistics. To those inside the stockades, it was a slow tightening of the net. Inside Fort Cass, a man named George Hicks, a Cherokee headman appointed to assist in organizing the detachments, wrote a letter to Chief Ross, still in Washington. "Our people are gathered like cattle. Disease spreads. The soldiers say we will depart soon, but no preparations are made for the journey. I fear we will die here before we ever see the West." Ross would later return too late to stop it. The machine had already begun to move without him. In mid-June, the first convoy left Fort Butler, escorted by Lieutenant Diaz. It consisted of 466 Cherokee men, women, children, elders. They followed a route north toward the Tennessee River, bound for the West. The journey that would later stretch 800 miles began with this single column. Atsadi and her children were in one of the later groups, but the sound of departure echoed through every camp wagon, wheels creaking chains, clinking the sharp whistle of officers counting cadence. Rain turned the dirt roads to clay. Hooves sank. Wheels broke. The soldiers cursed and pushed forward. By evening, they camped along the creek, the prisoners sitting beneath soaked blankets, staring into fires that offered little heat. One officer wrote home that night, "I cannot tell whether I am performing duty or a sin." The act of removal was not a single explosion, but a long burning fuse, a policy that ignited every life it touched. For some, the spark meant sudden death. For others, the slow extinguishing of everything familiar. By July, reports from the camps reached Washington: sickness, rising deaths, uncounted supplies running low. Yet the operation continued. "Proceed with all convenient dispatch," the War Department replied. The bureaucracy of empire has no pause button. In the smaller settlements, Chattooga, Ellijay, Hickory, log detachments still combed the valleys for those who had fled. Some families hid in caves or among sympathetic white neighbors. One soldier recorded finding a mother and 3 children concealed in a hollow tree. He noted that they were removed without incident. The report does not say whether the tree still stood afterward. Meanwhile, at Ross's Landing, later to be named Chattanooga, hundreds more were loaded onto flatboats to be carried downriver. They called the journey the River Route. Cholera struck within days. Bodies were buried along the banks unmarked. The army ordered new detachments to take the overland path instead. The removal had become a contagion of obedience. Once begun, it could not be stopped without infecting those who carried it out. Officers followed orders, soldiers followed officers. The displaced followed the road, each group trapped by the logic of command. For Atsadi, the fuse burned closer when troops arrived at her settlement. She had heard rumors of delay of Chief Ross negotiating safe passage of permission to remain until autumn. But when the horses appeared on the ridge, she knew the time for belief had ended. The sergeant at her door spoke gently, but his musket was loaded. She lifted her blanket, gathered her pot, and walked out without a word. Her children followed. Behind them, the cabin door swung open in the wind, revealing a shelf of cornmeal, a clay pipe, a wall carved with symbols of her clan. When the soldiers moved on, the cabin was burned to prevent their return. The smoke rose slowly, merging with the mist, until nothing distinguished sky from loss. That day she joined the hundreds waiting near the road to Fort Cass. The lines were long, the guards impassive. Someone was singing a hymn translated from English Guide Us, O Thou Great Jehovah. The sound wove through the crowd like thread through torn fabric. The march had not yet begun, but the journey already had. What forced them to move was not one event, but the collision of many a treaty signed without consent. A deadline imposed by law, an army ordered by ambition, and a nation too proud to disappear quietly. The The Cherokee did not rise in rebellion. They rose in endurance. The fuse had been lit by policy, but it would burn through families, language, and land before it reached its end. In the weeks that followed, the camps filled, the roads filled, and the silence of the hills deepened. Summer pressed on. The sound of drums from New Echota ceased. The capital of a sovereign people became an empty field. On the maps of the War Department, new lines appeared, routes marked in blue pencil labeled Emigrant Detachments 113. To the soldiers, they were logistics. To history, they were graves. This was how the journey began, not with battle, not with rebellion, but with obedience enforced at the end of a bayonet. The fuse had been burning for years. In 1838, it finally reached the powder. And when it did, the explosion was silent, a nation disappearing into motion. The orders said proceed west with all possible speed. But in the valleys of Tennessee, the earth had its own plans. By late September 1838, the first detachments gathered near Ross's Landing. The summer heat had lifted, leaving the air heavy with mist from the river. The boats lay moored against the bank, crude flat-bottom barges intended to carry wagons, livestock, and hundreds of passengers. To the officers, it was a logistical operation, load count move. To those being loaded, it was the unmaking of the world they knew. Lieutenant Diaz inspected the river and frowned. The Tennessee was swollen from weeks of rain, its surface moving fast and dark. He wrote, "The current renders embarkation dangerous, yet delay invites sickness." Behind him, rows of families waited, shivering in the fog, clutching bundles of cornmeal and blankets. Soldiers shouted numbers, trying to fit human lives into columns of arithmetic. The Army's intent was speed. Each day of delay meant more rations consumed, more sickness, more reports to Washington demanding explanation. The Cherokee leaders, placed nominally in charge of their own detachments, had a different intent: to buy time to move only when survival allowed. Between these two intentions lay the terrain itself, indifferent and absolute. On the morning of October 1st, the first barge pushed away from the bank. Its oars dipped into the water with the sound of bones cracking. A soldier shouted cadence. The current ignored him. Halfway across, the rope slipped from the ferry post. The vessel spun, drifted, struck a logjam, and nearly capsized. Panic rippled through the passengers. Children screamed. Men lunged to balance the deck. By miracle or current, they reached the far shore, drenched and silent. That day, the Army learned its first lesson. The map does not account for mud. For the next week, rain fell without pause. The roads from the river toward Arkansas turned to liquid clay. Wagon wheels sank to their hubs. Oxen collapsed in the traces. A single day's march could take 3. The officers called it slow progress. The Cherokee called it the Earth's resistance. At a bend near the Hiwassee Crossing, the column halted again. The soldiers needed to build a bridge from felled trees. They worked in silence, swinging axes until their hands blistered. The Cherokee women used the delay to gather roots and acorns, anything to stretch the dwindling rations. In the evening, smoke from hundreds of small fires rose through the mist, a silent city of endurance. Then the turning point came, not from battle or command, but from the weather itself. On the 10th day of the march, a cold front swept down from the Cumberland Plateau. The rain turned to sleet. Horses stumbled. Men's breath smoked in the air. Frost formed on the barrels of rifles. In the morning light, the road glittered white, beautiful, and deadly. Lieutenant Diaz ordered the march to continue. General Scott had warned that delays invited disease. Disease invited criticism. Criticism endangered careers. The soldiers obeyed. They pressed forward across the frozen mud, their boots sticking with each step. Behind them, wagons shattered axles. Children fell ill. Mothers carried them wrapped in blankets stiff with ice. The Army's objective movement now clashed with the land's command stillness. At a narrow pass near the Sequatchie Valley, the trail wound between steep ridges. Here, the geography made choice impossible. The wagons could not turn back, and the river beside them had flooded its banks. The column became a living chain stretching for miles, trapped between rock and water. Diaz wrote, "Progress impossible. To halt means starvation. To advance means peril." It was there that a single decision changed the rhythm of the entire removal. Captain Sitgreaves, commanding a 2nd detachment, chose to divide his column, sending half overland by the higher ridge trail, while the rest remained near the river. The intention was efficiency. The result was chaos. The ridge path, slick with frost, claimed wagons and lives. The lower path flooded, consumed the remainder. For 3 days, no communication passed between the groups. When they reunited near the western bank, 48 people were dead. The reports blamed exposure. The word is cold, clean, and false. Exposure means the sky had more power than the state. By mid-October, the detachments that survived the river crossings reached the highlands of Middle Tennessee. Here, the terrain opened into rolling fields, the land pale with early frost. The Army hoped for speed. Instead, they found resistance in the smallest things: broken harnesses, sick horses, roads eroded into trenches. Yet, amid the failure of order, a strange resilience emerged. The Cherokee detachments began to self-organize. Women took charge of rations. Elders chose resting grounds based on water and shelter. Scouts rode ahead to warn of sickness or danger. The forced migration designed as submission was quietly transforming into an act of survival by collective intelligence. Near Winchester, a second turning point appeared. The Army quartermaster miscalculated supplies, sending wagons of flour and bacon to the wrong route. For nearly a week, there was nothing but cornmeal and cold water. Disease spread. Then the unexpected happened. Local farmers, some sympathetic, left food along the roadside. Corn left in baskets, milk in clay jars, no words attached. Soldiers noted the generosity, but were ordered not to interfere. Acts of kindness, though small, became the only form of rebellion allowed. Atsadi and her surviving child marched in the middle of one such column. Her pot, dented from the journey, now held more soil than food. She used it to boil grass for flavor. In one soldier's log appears a brief entry. Indian woman lent our men fire to dry powder. She asked nothing in return. That was her footprint on history, a moment of utility mistaken for mercy. The campaign moved again. Beyond the Tennessee frontier, they entered the open lands of Arkansas. The weather turned crueler. Frost hardened into ice. Wagons broke against frozen ruts. The river routes, once thought quicker, became traps for disease. Officers argued over which path to take. Each mile now cost lives. At the White River crossing, the campaign met its final test of terrain. The ice had thickened just enough to deceive, strong at the edges, thin in the middle. The soldiers decided to push the wagons across rather than wait. The first two made it. The third broke through. Screams echoed across the valley. Men rushed to pull the survivors from the freezing water. 2 children and 1 soldier drowned. The Army report listed 3 casualties. In the Cherokee memory, it was the day the river swallowed their reflection. After that crossing, the tone of the march changed. The Army's control loosened. Winter had stripped authority of meaning. Orders became suggestions. The Cherokee detachments began setting their own pace, stopping where water was clean, where the wind could be broken by hills. They built lean-tos from saplings, covered them with hides, and called them Duyutvi, shelters of endurance. One night, as sleet rattled on the tents, a soldier overheard an elder tell the children that the land itself was testing them, that if they could survive its anger, it would one day remember their footprints. The soldier wrote that line in his diary and later showed it to his commanding officer. The officer said nothing, only closed the book. The Army's strategy had been to move people like freight. The land through rain and frost taught another rule. Nothing living moves without leaving a mark. By December, the survivors reached the edge of the new Indian territory. The final miles were easier, the ground flat and hard under frost. Yet no one called it arrival. The last order, recorded by Lieutenant Diaz, read simply, "All detachments delivered as instructed." Delivered as if history were a shipment, not a story. The turning point of the Trail of Tears was not a single act of violence or defiance. It was this realization that the true commander of the campaign was neither general nor treaty, but the ground itself. Mud, river, frost, hunger, these were the elements that bent an empire's intent. What the Army called progress was slowed, broken, reshaped by the physical world it tried to master. When spring thawed, the land months later, travelers along the Tennessee road found traces of the passage, broken wheels, half buried in clay. A child's shoe caught in the root of a cypress, ashes from countless campfires washed white by rain. The earth had recorded what the reports tried to sanitize. In the War Department's archives, the final note for the 1838 removal reads, "Operation completed satisfactorily." The map of the United States had indeed expanded, but the map of its conscience had narrowed. On that ground, in mud, ice, and silence, the first great campaign of forced migration in American history found its shape. And the land, not the generals, wrote its verdict. The Mississippi River in winter does not forgive. By late December 1838, ice sheeted across its surface, thin as glass and sharp as judgment. The Cherokee detachments under Chief John Ross had reached its eastern bank near the confluence of the Ohio. Nearly 10,000 people, exhausted, hungry, and freezing. The crossing would take days. The Army called it Phase 4 transit. In the official report sent to the War Department on January 15, 1839, Quartermaster Edward Diaz summarized the event in a single paragraph. The emigrating parties crossed without incident, save for a few unavoidable losses owing to severe weather. The discipline of the detachments remained good. The journey proceeded satisfactorily. 3 sentences. No names, no grief. A line item under provisions expended. But another record exists. In a small leather-bound notebook, now held in the archives of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the missionary Daniel Butrick wrote on the same day, "It was a scene of distress which language cannot describe. Mothers held their dead infants against the breast to keep them warm, though life had departed. Men sunk down in the snow and none could help them. The wind blew keenly from the north, and the river roared beneath its crust of ice. I never witnessed such misery before. Both men stood on the same riverbank. Both recorded what they saw. Yet their words live in opposite climates, one frozen by official duty, the other burning with witness. To the Army, the Mississippi was an obstacle to be managed. To the Cherokee, it was a threshold between a world lost and a future unwelcome. That difference in language became the difference in memory. The official report, written in the measured tone of bureaucracy, transformed catastrophe into efficiency. Without incident, a phrase meant to soothe superiors in Washington, to assure them that order had triumphed over chaos. The War Department required smooth sentences, not truths jagged with cold. Numbers could be counted, despair could not. Buttrick's diary had no such restraint. He had traveled with the detachments for months, recording the births, the burials, the sermons whispered over frozen ground. His ink bled from dampness. On December 28th, he described the crossing again. The snow continued falling heavily. The river ice cracked under the weight of the wagons. The ferries were delayed and many were compelled to wait without shelter. I saw with my own eyes women whose clothing was frozen upon them. He ended the entry with a single question. Is this mercy? Diaz never asked that question. His orders were to deliver bodies, not souls. The dissonance between the two accounts is not simply one of description, it is the fracture of purpose. The Army wrote for the government, the missionary wrote for God, the Cherokee, trapped between them, spoke through neither. The records diverge most sharply on one point: the number of dead. In the War Department's summary for the Ross detachments, total casualties during the winter march are listed as 311 deaths. Buttrick's count, drawn from burial logs and personal witness records, at least 200. The difference is not arithmetic, it is ideology. To understand why, we must look at how death was defined. For Diaz and his officers, only those who perished on the road under escort were entered in the log. Anyone who died within days of arrival or in camps awaiting resettlement was omitted as not directly under transport. The policy of record-keeping itself erased the full measure of loss. Buttrick's journal ignored jurisdiction. He wrote of every grave he saw, marked or unmarked. This morning we buried a mother and child beneath a hackberry tree. I counted 19 in this camp alone, who will never see the setting of another sun. Two systems of seeing, one that measured logistics, the other humanity. A similar clash appears in the accounts of the night the ice broke. According to the Army's report, several of the Indians attempted to cross on foot against orders. The ice gave way, resulting in some casualties. The command promptly rescued the remainder. Order was restored. Buttrick's diary records the same event in different weather. The soldiers drove them forward, fearing delay. The river cracked beneath them with a sound like thunder. I heard the cries of children and the screams of mothers, but the wind carried them away. The ice closed again, leaving no trace but silence. Where the Army used verbs of control, attempted, restored. Rescued, Buttrick used verbs of loss. Drove, cracked, screamed. Each word reveals allegiance. And yet, between them, there are small points of overlap that confirm the event occurred, the date, the location, the weather, the aftermath. Both agree that the temperature was below zero, that the wind came from the north, that the march continued the next morning. Both omit one thing: the names of the dead. Why? Because names made responsibility personal, and personal responsibility has no place in official archives. There is one final witness to this moment, though his voice arrived much later. In 1841, a Cherokee survivor named Richard Taylor, who had been a young interpreter during the removal, gave testimony recorded by a Baptist missionary in Indian Territory. His account bridges the gap between the two written extremes. The officers did what they were told. The preacher wrote what he felt. Both spoke truth, but not the same truth. What we saw was worse than either could say. Taylor described the Mississippi not as a single crossing, but as a trial repeated in every mile a river of ice we walked, even when there was no water. His memory does not contradict either document, it completes them. This triangulation Army missionary survivor exposes the central question of historical truth, not who lied, but who was allowed to define reality. For the government, the Trail of Tears was a logistical accomplishment, proof that policy could move populations like freight. For Buttrick, it was a moral indictment, a Christian nation condemning its converts to death. For the Cherokee, it was existence itself rewritten by others. In the archives of the War Department, the report from Quartermaster Diaz ends with the line, "The operation is now complete. All parties delivered as ordered. No mention of ice hunger or loss, just completion." In Buttrick's final entry of that same winter, written after reaching Indian Territory, he reflected, "They call it completion, I call it crucifixion." Between those two sentences lies the distance between paperwork and pain. What then is truth? Perhaps both and neither. The official record shows how a government explains itself. The missionary diary shows how conscience tries to survive inside that explanation. History needs both to remain whole. Without the army's ledger, we would not know the scale. Without the missionary's anguish, we would not feel the cost. But the space between them, the silence where no pen was permitted, belongs to the people who walked. If you listen to the oral histories still told among the Cherokee Nation today, the Mississippi crossing remains a dividing line. Some elders speak of it as the day the river took names. Others call it the silent water. None describe it as without incident. In one modern retelling, recorded in 1937 by the Works Progress Administration, an old woman said simply, "They wrote what they saw, but not what we carried." That sentence dissolves the debate. It reminds us that history's first casualty is not truth but context. The army wrote for the future it served. The missionary wrote for the faith he feared had failed. The Cherokee carried memory forward not on paper, but in song soil and survival. When these records collide, the sound they make is not noise. It is evidence the friction where empathy burns against order. And in that friction, the truth flickers for a moment, a light on the river before the ice closes again. By the spring of 1839, the march had ended, but the movement had not stopped. The roads that carried the Cherokee west had emptied, yet the people still walked in their sleep. Every dream smelled of smoke, river water, and mud. The final detachments arrived through the last days of March. Snowmelt turned the prairie to slick clay. Wagons sank even as they reached the new settlements. The soldiers recorded each arrival by number. Detachment 12 complete. Detachment 13 delayed by rain. Each line in the ledger was a punctuation mark closing the record of exile. At Fort Gibson, Lieutenant Dias wrote his last report to the War Department. All emigrants delivered, rations expended, stores to be transferred, personnel returning east. He added a note at the bottom, almost as afterthought, mission accomplished with humanity and diligence. That was the last entry under his name. The handwriting ends abruptly, the ink lighter at the edge of the page, as though even the pen had nothing left to say. In the same week, missionary Daniel Butrick opened his final notebook. His first line, "They have reached the land appointed, but their hearts are still traveling." He described rows of tents along the Verdigris River, the smoke rising in columns like prayers still unanswered. Every house built here, he wrote, rests upon a grave. The camps became towns. The stockades became fences. The people who had been counted as emigrants began to count themselves again as nation. But inside that rebirth, a fracture deepened between those who had signed the Treaty of New Echota and those who had resisted it. The treaty signers, Major Ridge John Ridge Elias Boudinot and their families, had believed removal was inevitable and that survival required consent. John Ross and his followers saw that consent as betrayal. Both were right, both were wrong. The council that met in the early spring of 1839 tried to heal the divide. They gathered in a half-built structure at Takatoka's camp, the wind cutting through the gaps between logs. Ross spoke of unity. Ridge spoke of peace. Between them, silence. No amount of words could bridge the gulf, carved by 800 miles of loss. The minutes of that council survive, but only in fragments. The clerk's handwriting falters midway through a sentence describing strong emotions among the members. The next page is blank, the ink seeped through from rain. Outside, fires burned low. The night was cold again. Then came June, the point of no return. On the morning of June 22, 1839, the sun rose red over the settlement at Park Hill. Birds sang above the half-finished church, the same one where missionaries had preached endurance. Major Ridge rode out early to inspect his fields. He was 69 years old. His horse was white, his coat dark. He had told his son the night before, "If I must die for what I signed, so be it." Around the same hour, Elias Boudinot walked toward the mission press, carrying a parcel of tracts for distribution. Nearby, John Ridge was preparing for travel to a neighboring settlement. By noon, all three men lay dead. The official report filed by the Indian Agency reads, "This day, June 20, 1839, three prominent Cherokees, Ridge Boudinot and John Ridge, were assassinated by unknown persons. Motive presumed political, public order restored." 4 lines clipped impersonal. The missionary record offers another version. Butrick wrote, "The vengeance long restrained has broken. I heard shots near the ridge road and saw smoke rising. The air trembled with the cries of men. I fear the wound among this people can never close." For the Cherokee that morning was the moment history turned inward, when the suffering imposed from outside was replaced by grief from within. The trail of tears had ended. The era of rebuilding began with blood. Afterward, the council met again. The room smelled of wet timber and fear. A clerk read a resolution declaring amnesty and unity, but no one spoke. Chief Ross stood by the window, his hair gray at the temples, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the old trails vanished into haze. "We will not go back," he said quietly. "There is no back." The words were not recorded in the official minutes. They survive only in a missionary's marginal note, written in faint pencil beside a verse from Psalms, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." But the joy never came. The records of 1839 close with an eerie precision. In the War Department archives, the file labeled Cherokee Emigration ends with a page stamped final. The next document in the sequence is blank, except for a catalog number. There is no summary, no reflection, no final count of the dead. The archive itself falls silent, as though history, having exhausted its language, could only offer absence. In Buttrick's journal, the last entry is dated August 1st, 1839. The season of rain returns. The graves grow grass. I will write no more. Then nothing. The pages beyond are empty. Atsadi's name, never truly recorded, disappears here too. Her pot, cracked and patched, is not listed in any museum. No one wrote where she was buried or when. She became one of the unremarked. Yet her story lingers in the oral traditions, the woman who carried corn in an iron pot from east to west, who planted it in the new soil so her people would not starve. The Cherokee Nation later sang of her in fragments, "She walked with the fire in her hands." In that sense, she reached the point of no return long before the records did. Her old world ended on the morning her cabin burned in Georgia. Every mile after that was aftermath. By autumn 1839, a new Cherokee capital rose at Tahlequah: council houses, mission schools, printing presses. The Cherokee Phoenix would publish again its first issue, beginning with a single line in both English and syllabary, "We are still here." That sentence, printed in ink, became the closing line of an unwritten book. The United States would move on, expanding westward, writing new treaties, opening new lands. But for the Cherokee, the map would forever hold a scar shaped like a road. The Trail of Tears was over. The Trail of Remembrance had just begun. And so, the documents end, one by bureaucratic closure, the other by human exhaustion. The ledgers balance, the ink dries, the pages stop turning. Somewhere beyond those final lines, life continued, crops planted, children born, stories whispered in a language the government tried to erase. But in the archive, the silence after 1839 is the loudest sound of all. That is the point of no return, when a nation loses the ability to go back, when the page itself becomes the grave marker, when the record closes, and all that remains is memory. In the year after the march, the land where the Cherokee arrived had no roads, no boundaries, no names. The War Department maps called it simply Indian Territory. To the people who stepped onto its frozen soil, it was both an ending and an unwelcome beginning. By the spring of 1840, the survivors had built a capital at Tahlequah, a school at Park Hill, and a printing house that revived the Cherokee Phoenix. In the records of the Indian Office, a single line confirms it: the Cherokee have reestablished a seat of government west of the Mississippi. The sentence is cold, bureaucratic, but behind it lies the quiet miracle of survival. Fields were planted again. Corn sprouted where graves had been dug only months earlier. The people held council under the shade of young oaks, and for the first time since the exile began, decisions were made without the sound of commands shouted in English. The Constitution of the Cherokee Nation was rewritten in 1840, ratified the following year. It declared simply, "We the people are of one blood and one destiny." Yet unity remained fragile. The assassinations of the Ridge faction in 1839 had torn the nation in two. For nearly a decade, factions feuded in courts and in silence. In 1846, under pressure from the United States, the Cherokee signed a new treaty promising reconciliation, the Treaty of Washington. The treaty confirmed their western lands and secured new aid for education and infrastructure. It also reaffirmed the supremacy of federal oversight. Every new beginning came with a signature that tied it back to the government that had removed them. That same year, the first boarding school opened in Indian Territory, the Cherokee Male Seminary. Its architecture mirrored New England academies: tall windows, brick facades, the flag flying above. Lessons were taught in English. Cherokee was permitted only in whispers. Missionaries praised the civilizing success. Buttrick, now old and frail, wrote in his final letter, "They have learned the tongue of their captors, but I fear they will forget the language of their grief." 5 years became 10. By 1850, the Indian Territory had grown crowded. Other displaced nations, Creek Choctaw, Chickasaw Seminole, built towns nearby. The land once meant to be a refuge turned into a mosaic of boundaries and treaties, each one redrawn as white settlers pushed from the east. Stage routes cut through the prairie. Military forts multiplied: Fort Towson, Fort Arbuckle, Fort Washita, each an anchor of federal power amid native soil. For the Cherokee, the promise of permanence was again eroding. Taxes, trade, and law were filtered through Washington. Every improvement was measured against compliance. The Phoenix printed editorials warning that progress could once again become the mask of removal. Atsadi's name does not appear in any of those records, but her legacy does. The corn she planted in 1839 still grew near the creek beside Tahlequah. By 1852, her grandchildren attended the seminary she would not have recognized. They wrote their names in English. Their mother signed the attendance ledger with a trembling hand, leaving beside it a small mark 3 parallel lines, the symbol for river. 20 years later, the Civil War reached even this isolated nation. In 1861, the Cherokee split again, some siding with the Union, others with the Confederacy. Once more, politics from afar turned their homeland into a battlefield. Villages were burned, treaties rewritten. By war's end in 1806, a new treaty stripped away yet more land, opening parts of Indian Territory to railway companies and settlers. The clause read, "Lands not in use may be allotted or sold for the purpose of progress." Progress, the same word that had once marched beside removal. Through the 1870s and 1880s, that clause became a knife. Surveyors entered with chains and compasses, cutting the ground into squares. The communal farms became allotments. The rivers gained new names. The Dawes Act of 1887 formalized it, the end of collective landholding, the privatization of the earth itself. Each family received a plot, each individual a boundary. The idea of land as shared memory was replaced by land as property. In 1890, when the federal census reached Indian Territory, the enumerator described Tahlequah as a town like any other. He listed schools, churches, a telegraph office. He did not list the burial mounds by the river or the unmarked graves beneath the cottonwoods. The new map showed progress. It concealed the cost. 80 years after the first removal, a Cherokee historian named Ruth Muskrat Bronson stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol and read aloud a petition for Native education reform. Her voice, clear and firm, carried across the marble echo of empire. "We do not ask for charity. We ask for justice." It was 1923, one lifetime after the trail. The government applauded politely. The map of America by then had swallowed but almost all of Indian Territory. Oklahoma was a state. The old boundary lines existed only in archives, and yet some traces refused erasure. The word Tahlequah still meant two or different, a reminder that survival itself was an act of distinction. In the museum built near the old mission house, one cracked iron pot sits behind glass labeled "Only Cooking Vessel, Signature 1830-1840, Cherokee Removal Period." No one knows whose hands last held it. Perhaps it was hers. Perhaps it was everyone's. In that object, the long arc of consequence folds into silence, the treaties signed. The schools built, the land renamed, the languages silenced, the borders redrawn. A nation displaced once, then divided, then assimilated, yet still alive. The new map of America was born from these coordinates, the erasure of thousands of names, the red ink of treaties, the black ink of laws, and the faint pencil lines where memory tried to redraw what history had taken away. When modern surveyors trace the same land today, satellite maps show straight lines and highways. U.S. Route 62, Interstate 40, the Arkansas River running west. But beneath them, invisible to satellites, unmarked by signage, lies another geometry made of footsteps. From Georgia to Oklahoma, the soil still holds the pattern of a march. In the archives of the Cherokee Nation, one final ledger from 1907, the year Oklahoma became a state, carries a single closing note written in both English and syllabary. "The land remembers." That is the last line of the old record and the first line of the new map. At dawn in Tahlequah, when fog still hangs low over the river valley, the air carries a sound older than the town itself, the soft rhythm of hymn singing in Cherokee. The words are half English, half ancient syllabary, blending into a language that survived both removal and silence. The song is called Amazing Grace, but here it is not a hymn of salvation. It is a memorial. Every year in late May, descendants of those who walked the trail gather beside the river. They launch small wreaths woven of cedar and sweetgrass, letting the current carry them east, back toward Georgia, toward the homeland they will never see. The ceremony is quiet. No speeches. Only the sound of water against the bank. In those wreaths float the names of the unrecorded, the mothers who buried children by the roadside, the soldiers who wrote without understanding, the interpreters who forgot which language they were speaking. For a moment, the river becomes a ledger again, but this time written by hands that remember. A few miles from the gathering stands the Cherokee National Cemetery. The stones there are carved in 2 alphabets. Some are new granite, others weathered sandstone taken from nearby creeks. The oldest markers bear no names, only spirals and lines, patterns meant to represent movement. Local elders say the designs are not decoration, but direction. The spiral marks the journey east to west, and the straight line beneath means we continued. Each spring, children from the Cherokee Nation schools visit the cemetery. They are taught to trace the syllabary with their fingers and read aloud the words carved there, Adadoli, family, fire, river. The lesson is not about death, but continuity. A teacher explains, when you speak the names, you turn silence into breath. Beyond Tahlequah, the land itself keeps the archive. Rivers like the Etowah, Hiwassee, and Ustanaula still bear their Cherokee names. Even when settlers built towns over them, the original words remain their meanings, faint but intact. In Cherokee, Etowah means tribal town, Hiwassee means meadow, Ustanaula means rock that talks. Each is both place and sentence. To say them is to recite fragments of an old map, a geography of belonging that outlived its political borders. In a way, the language became the last territory that could not be confiscated. While land titles changed hands, words traveled invisibly from mouth to mouth. The syllabary invented by Sequoyah, a generation before removal, became the vessel for survival. In the 21st century, linguists still record elders speaking in Cherokee. Around firelight, their accents echoing the same cadence that carried songs across the trail. Digital archives now hold more Cherokee text than ever before, proof that the endonym, the name from within, is stronger than any line drawn from outside. Near Park Hill stands a small museum built on the site of the old mission house. Inside, beneath glass, lies a cracked iron pot. The label reads, Cooking Vessel, Sikia 1830-1840, removal period. No one knows whose it was. Some visitors imagine it belonged to one woman, perhaps Atsadi, perhaps someone like her who carried it from Georgia, filled it with soil, and planted corn in it on arrival. Each year, schoolchildren place 3 kernels of corn beside that display. It has become tradition not to worship, but to remember the act of planting after loss. The museum's curator explains to them, this is our first archive, not paper, not ink, the earth. Outside, the same soil grows cedar trees now. Their roots intertwine around stones, their branches catch the wind. In Cherokee belief, cedar holds the memory of voices. When it moves, it repeats what it once heard. Standing beneath it, you can almost hear the march, the creak of wagons, the low hum of songs against frost. In 2004, the Cherokee Nation designated the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail as sacred ground. Markers now trace the 200-mile route across 9 states. Each marker carries both English and Cherokee inscriptions. At first glance, they look like monuments, but to the descendants who walk them each year, they are waypoints of remembrance, coordinates of endurance. During the annual Trail of Tears Memorial Bike Ride, riders from Oklahoma travel east to Georgia, retracing the path in reverse. Along the way, they stop at every historical site, Fort Payne, Ross's Landing, Red Clay. At each, they pour a handful of Oklahoma soil on the ground. One rider explained to a journalist, "We're giving the land back a piece of what it lost." This act of reversal has no official sanction. It needs none. Memory, after all, requires no permit. In academic circles, historians now describe the Trail of Tears not merely as a tragedy, but as a forced redefinition of geography. The phrase sounds clinical, but its meaning is profound. The idea that when land and people are severed, both are permanently altered. The historian Theda Perdue once wrote, "What removal accomplished was not disappearance, but transformation, the invention of a new geography of identity." That geography exists not on paper, but in the pattern of remembering. Every time a child in Tahlequah speaks a word from the old language, the boundary of that geography expands. Every time a descendant touches the carved stone of a grave, the border of forgetting recedes a little further. On the eastern edge of the Cherokee Nation stands a marker overlooking a field of wild grass. It bears no statue, no flag, only an inscription in both languages. The land remembers, and so do we. Behind the words, the prairie stretches to the horizon, golden in the late sun. No trace of the old trail is visible, but the air carries a feeling, a kind of vibration that hums when the wind shifts. Locals call it the breath beneath the ground. Scientists describe it as wind moving through layered soil. Elders call it something else, the voices that remain. They say that if you listen long enough, you can hear the rhythm of feet not marching but returning. And that perhaps is the truest legacy. Not the Trail of Tears, but the trail of voices still walking through the land that remembers. The trail ended in Oklahoma, but its shadow runs through every border we've drawn since. Do you think maps can ever tell the truth, or do they always hide someone's loss? Let's talk in the comments.